Okay, hello, welcome everyone to the CJS seminar. And today I'm happy to be welcoming Professor Stephen Dodd. Professor Dodd gained 2 Bachelor of Arts degrees, one in Chinese and one in Japanese from Keble College, Oxford. He then went on to Columbia University to complete a doctorate at the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. And after a stint at teaching at Duke University, he moved to SOAS, University of London, where he stayed until 2019 and where he is still Professor Emeritus of Japanese Literature. Some of you here today, certainly my students for Japanese literature, will be familiar with his writing on and lovely translations of Kaji Motojiro in his book, The Youth of Things, Life and Death in the Age of Kaji Motojiro. But he is also the author of Writing Home, Representations of the Native Place in Modern Japanese Literature, which explores the furusato or native place as an idealized literary space in Meiji, Taisho and Showa writing. Today, Professor Dodd is going to be talking to us about the 2 Mishima novels he has translated over the course of the last 3 years. The first of these is Inochi Urimasu, or Life for Sale, which came out in 2019 and was originally published serially, I believe, in the Japanese weekly Playboy magazine in 1968. And the second, a sci-fi novel, Utsukushii Hoshi, or Beautiful Star, originally published in 1962, which is due to come out, I believe, in April 2022, so 60 years later. Thank you. Welcome, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real, it really is a pleasure to see Hannah again, to be introduced by Hannah. I've known Hannah, I can't actually remember when it was, but some years in the past, Hannah was began taking an MA course at SARS, and she was in my class, and she really was a beautiful star in that class. And she really got people, those who know her will know just how she gets people excited about ideas and so on. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, visually, virtually, if nothing else. So what I'm going to talk about today is about the translation, the process of translating, and specifically related to my experience of translating a couple of novels by Mishima Yukio. I'm kind of wearing 2 hats. I mean, I've been an academic. That is, most of my career has been spent researching and writing academic papers related to Japanese literature. But as time has gone by, I've become more interested in the actual, the practical side of translating literature. So, in a way, I'm wearing those 2 hats. Mostly it's going to be about the practical side, but you can't take the academic out of me. There's a little academic side to it as well. So bear with me if you don't. If you can, please. So first of all, so there are 2 Mishima novels that I'm talking about today, and as you see on the left, Yukio Mishima, Life for Sale. A lot of my women friends found that picture very upsetting, because as you can see, it shows a woman being kind of tortured and hung up like that. And my answer, actually, both of these pictures were taken from a very famous modern painter, who I think his name is Yoko. I'm not the painter type, but in a way, my response to that first picture, I like the image because it is gruesome, it is sexual, it is sexist, it's all those things you'd expect of someone, a male writing in the 1960s. But I fully understand why people might take a bit of offense to that particular picture. And the one on the right, you have a preview of what's coming out in April, because this is, I was aware that this picture is going to be used. You see it looks rather sci-fi-ish, but I did find it online, so I'm not giving away any state secrets, I don't think. Right, so let's move on. I want to just show the sort of things that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to say, just give some background information about Yukio Mishima, about his life in literature, so who he is, where he comes from, how he fits into the as it were, the canon of modern Japanese literature. And then there are the two stories, or the two novels that I've been involved with. As Hannah mentioned, Life was Silent came out in 1968. But my translation came out, the English translation came out in August 2019. So I'll say something about that, or to give an outline of it. And then Beautiful Star, Utsukushii Hoshi, was first written, as Hannah says, yes, it's 60 years, yes. It's 1962 it came out, and then my part of the work has been completed. I've looked at from my perspective, the final proofs, and but the plan is that it will come out. It's a seasonal thing, I think, with publishers. It will come in April next year. And then I'm going to just touch generally on this term translation. Well, for those who are doing translation studies will be very aware of this, but also for all of us, just to bear in mind that translation means lots of different things depending on what your particular interest is. I'll go into detail about that in a moment. And then I'll touch on two more sort of closely tied aspects to the novels I've been translating. First of all, the historical context, the way in which these novels should be understood. And in that sense, it affects the way we translate. Hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll be convinced that translation is not simply translating one word for another word, but it actually involves a lot of assumptions and readings, or possibly misreadings. But in any case, you can't forget the historical context, because it does affect the way your own word choice as a translator. And then I've got a little list of practical problems related to translation. They're by no means exhaustive, and I really do want to leave some time, hopefully, for anyone who's interested in translation, or is doing translation already, or is thinking about doing it, what the pitfalls are. But you may have all your other questions or suggestions related to that. So it'd be great to have an exchange over that. And then finally, there'll be a little conclusion where I try and suggest that translating is not a kind of mechanical process, but there's a certain artfulness about it. Okay, so actually, let me just close. It's better. As far as, so I'm just looking for my, that's there. My images were in the way. Okay, so who was Yukio Mishima? Well, probably most of you who are here today know something about him, but it's good to bear in mind that he had multiple roles. He was a novelist, a poet, a playwright, a film director, a nationalist, or I should say an ultra-nationalist. In terms of his literary output, he was a very influential and prominent figure in post-war Japanese, in the world of post-war Japanese literature. And he really was, I mean, I won't use the word genius, but he had a capacity to go from one genre to another. For instance, in his plays, he did kabuki, traditional kabuki plays for modern audience, and he also did contemporary plays as well. So and like when he wrote modern kabuki plays, he wrote in a kind of semi-classical style reminiscent of the age of kabuki, which was, pre-modern. So he was really, really gifted. He was very linguistically gifted. He had a real touch for language, and he even he did some film directing. He appeared in films. He was a really ham actor, a kind of third, what do they call it, a sort of a pound shop gangster, but I think it rather turned him on. He really enjoyed it. And then there's the nationalist side, which certainly, if you speak to Japanese academics who tend to be on the left in Japan, most of those feel very uncomfortable about Mishima's legacy. and for good reason. I mean, basically, Mishima is flirting with fascism, or I think is Keith Vincent, who's written about Mishima, really interesting scholar, called him a homo-fascist. I would say that as a gay man, so there's nothing about being gay, but there's this sort of homoeroticism and fascism that he's playing with. It's the kind of the black shirt attraction. He was considered for the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968, but he lost out to Kawabata Yasunari, who you probably know got the prize with Snow Country. And some say that that's why Mishima sort of became more drawn towards the idea of a glorious death, because of his disappointment in any possibility of getting a Nobel Prize for Literature. Well, he wrote many books, many plays and so on, but a couple of novels that you might know or I would recommend you read. Confessions of a Mask, 1949, was his first big novel, which is all about being a child, growing up and becoming aware of his sexuality, his homosexuality, and trying to articulate those feelings. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on. It's not just about his homosexuality, but of course it's integral to the identity of the author, or of the character, I should say. We're not talking about Mishima himself, we're talking about the character. So always the difference between the I in a novel and the author, as any teacher tells you. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting and complex and intelligent and thoughtful and provocative story. And another example, Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which is based on a true story of a monk, a young acolyte monk who went mad in the post-war period and burnt down the Golden Pavilion, which was in a temple in Kyoto. And so it's a kind of fictional account of why that happened. And Mishima's style, if you've not read any Mishima, hopefully you'll recognize this. It's a very rich, voluptuous language he can use. He's very keen on using complex Chinese characters. So when you're first starting out, if you first wanted to read Japanese literature in the original, if you're learning Japanese, then I would recommend that Mishima is not the person you start with, because it'll put you off, because he deliberately uses complex characters that even a Japanese will sometimes have to think, I don't remember seeing that one before. He's very imaginative, shocking. One thing about Mishima, he's kind of like Oscar Wilde, in the sense that Oscar Wilde always says something and then twists it the other way around. It's very self-parody, a mocking side to it, or self-conscious side to it. But that makes it very interesting. Although as a translator, it can be really hard, because generally, if you're translating something, you read a few pages and you kind of know where it's going. But of course, Mishima will say something and you'll think, he can't mean that, because that's exactly the opposite of what you'd expect him to say. But obviously, for Mishima, that's precisely what he does. So that's why it takes a long time for me anyway, to satisfyingly translate his work. And he's very open about talking about sexual matters and eroticism and desire. So interested in beauty, eroticism, death. In a sense, this has kind of been, as it were, being done to death. There isn't that much written about Mishima in English, but the stuff that is written tends to look at eroticism, sexuality, beauty, plunging in of knives and blood and gashes, and the usual. And also I've noticed that particularly on the Japanese side, things I've read, a lot of, well, not a lot, but there is some academic work which kind of implies that it's all to do with his sexual preference, his sexuality, his homosexuality, which I think is debatable, put it that way. And then in reality, in his own his personal history, 1970, he went to the Ichigaya self-defense base, that is the Jietai self-defense force base which is based, this is in a place in Tokyo, and he and a group of his own army, and he had a little army made up of cute boys that he found in universities, mostly Waseda, and he had a little army. They'd run up and down Mount Fuji every weekend, and they had uniforms made by the same designer who designed for Pierre Cardin. Very fashionable French clothes. So no one took him seriously. And then suddenly him and a couple of, three, I think, other of these army people went to the base and tried to encourage the army or the self-defense corps to rise up in the name of the emperor. Of course, they laughed in his face, and he went in and committed harakiri. He cut open his belly and died, obviously. So he's got all this literary background, but also all these other roles he has. He's a flamboyant star. He was like one of the first media stars. He was doing fantastic on social media. He's an actor, as I've mentioned before. Model, very interesting model. This book, Ordeal by Roses, you may be familiar with it, a set of very explicitly homoerotic pictures of him dressed in various loincloths and oil, and with spears and blades and arrows in the body and so on. So he really knew how to camp it up. That's what he was doing. And I say soldier, but soldier in parentheses, because it was, well, I don't know, it was more of a fantasy for him, I think. Let me move on. Okay. Yes. So Life for Sale, very briefly. This was written in 1968, 2 years before he died. And I think it's important to point that out, because this story, this novel that I translated, was about this character Hanyo, who at the very beginning has failed to commit suicide. And really the story is about, should one live or should one die? Is it worth living? And there's a moment near the beginning where Hanyo is in a, I think he's in a cafe, and he sees some cockroaches. He's reading a newspaper and can't make out the characters, and then realizes they're actually cockroaches and they run all over the place. So he kind of thinks, oh, the world is made up of these disgusting movable words. And in a kind of almost on a whim, he decides, oh, I think I'll kill myself. So he tries to kill himself, but he fails. And then in response to that, he gives up his work, and he puts an advert in the paper saying life for sale. And basically he's sort of prostituting himself. He's saying, I think he was 27, I think he was, 27-year-old man, and I'll do whatever you want. You can use me as you wish. My life is yours. And the story, or the novel, is a series of episodes where he encounters various people, the glamour puss, Ruriko. And I use that term specifically because it's very much a kind of sort of James Bondy 60s glamorous sexual kitten that he gets involved with. And then there's another, the second woman, the person is a woman with a beetle book. It's about a woman who's got this book on beetles, who falls in love with him. I won't go into the details. You can read it for yourself if you haven't read it. There's a really interesting episode with a particular embassy, all to do with chewed up carrots and secret codes and so on, which I won't go into now. There's a hippie, remember this is the 60s, Reiko, who wants to die with him, but he resists that. And then he's involved with, as ever with Mishima, there's some gangsters somewhere, and he encounters these gangsters, but then he kind of escapes. And then there's a point in the story where he looks up into the stars and feels like there's a beautiful moment actually where he looks tearfully at the stars, and then all the stars sort of blur into one. It's through the tears, so it's like he's watching this great starlight up above him. So there's something there's something profound about this, even though, as I say, it's trashy, kitsch, camp, shallow, sexy. It's all the things that, why wouldn't you want to read a book like that? But the question is it serious or is it shallow? And I will say something a little bit more about this if I have some time. Beautiful Star, this is the one that's going to come out, and it's as Hannah pointed out, it's a sci-fi story, which is one of the reasons, or probably the most important reason, why it's never been translated. Most of his serious novels, or I think all of his so-called serious novels, were translated decades ago because Mishima was considered a serious writer. Now, Mishima thought that Beautiful Star was one of his best novels, and he took it very seriously. And it is, and I'll point out in a moment why, but it is, as it were, a serious novel. But for many people, the very fact that it was a sci-fi story suggested that it was not to be taken seriously. And that, people did write about the story of the novel and say, how can you take a sci-fi novel seriously? Well, times have changed. We live in a world where we take seriously dramas on TV, or popular media, popular film, and also sci-fi. There's a serious aspect that we see in this. So I think it really is hopefully a good time to receive a novel like this and to take it seriously. And this story is about the Osugi family, and all members of the family believe that they come from different planets in the solar system, and their job is to save poor human beings who are in the process or look like they're on the verge of killing themselves through nuclear war. This is 1962. It's the age of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is when people seriously thought this was the end of the world. So the fact that you have these people concerned with nuclear war is not at all surprising. So in a sense, the Osugi family are the goodies. They're the good aliens. And then there's the baddies, they're deliciously baddie. Professor Haguro, well, I say Professor Haguro, actually he's, as Mishima keeps saying, he's Assistant Professor Haguro. And Professor Haguro really has a chip on his shoulder. He doesn't like not having made it. He's obviously someone he's always been spurned by others. So we can take his vicious attitude towards humanity as being a kind of built up resentment towards human beings. And I mean, a lot happens a lot happens in this story, but you have fundamentally these two groups, the good, as it were, the Osugi aliens and the Haguro aliens. And towards the end of the story, we have these two alien groups. It's actually Junichiro, who's the father of Osugi Junichiro, the father of that family, and Professor Haguro and his two minions. There are three baddies. The four of them get together and they have a long philosophical discussion about the value of human life, or are human beings a benefit to the universe, or are they a cancer that needs to be exterminated, to be cut out? And then finally, the Osugi the Osugi family flee to the suburbs with the aim of greeting a flying saucer and returning to their native planets. I'll leave it at that because obviously you have to. I don't want to spoil it if you think about reading it, but it's. I think it's a great story. I really do. But I suppose I would say that, wouldn't I? But anyway, that's the story. Okay, so now those are the stories I want to talk about. And what does translation mean? Well, translation means many things to many people. When as Hannah pointed out, I wrote a book on Kanji Motojido, which came out, I think, in 2014. And then, like many people, probably you finished a big project and you think, what next? Because I'd spent so many years on that Kanji project. And I decided, it had got into my head that translation, I want to do translation. I suppose really I was thinking I want to do practical translation. I want to translate novels. But I thought, well, that makes sense. I'll do translation studies first. And for those of you who have done any translation studies, you'll probably laugh at this and think, well, that's very naive of you. Well, I was very naive because I thought, I'm going to do practical translation. I'll do some translation studies to beef myself up. But of course, translation studies means many different things. And actually, it reminds me when I was very young, when I was like when I was like 18 or so, and I thought, well, I'm going to study literature in my life. I could see that coming along. I thought, oh, I'll study linguistics, because of what's linguistic? It's about language, it's about literature. And for those who know anything about linguistics, know that linguistics is a huge field. There's all applied linguistics or theoretical linguistics. There's so many different areas. And it's a very, very different field to literature. There's not, obviously, if you're into linguistics, that's fantastic. But if you're a literature person, it's, in the end, I realized it wasn't really for me. And in the same way, when I began to look at translation theory, I realized it's a huge field, and there are many different ways of approaching it. And of course, I did I did a considerable amount of reading. Don't test me on it today, because I've kind of forgotten most of it. But it was, again, I realized that, well, there are different approaches, and I was more interested in the practical side of things. But just to give us a sense of general translation theory, that is nothing specifically related to Japanese literature, there are names, I've just picked a few names at random, really. Walter Benjamin, extremely famous Frankfurt School of Marxism writer, who died in the, I guess it was the late 30s, or no, in the early 40s, wasn't it? I think. The Task of the Translator was a really fantastic essay that he wrote. Gideon Torne Itama, even, I can't see it because, hang on, make a nice, oh, there, Zohar, that's right, behind my box there. And Lawrence Venuti, who's an extremely famous person when it comes to translation studies. So just these sort of people who approach translation from all sorts of different angles. I mean, really, really fascinating, but not specifically related to the actual practical art of translation. And then there is a specific Japanese translation set of complexities related to the way the actual writing script. For those of you who know anything about Japan will know that they use characters, obviously, but they're Chinese characters brought from China, over 1,000 years ago. And there's always been this question about how to fit a Japanese word into a Chinese character. And for those who have studied Japanese will know it's a real, but I mean, absolutely fascinating. We love it. Well, I love it, definitely. But it's always a work in progress. You'll look at a character and say, how do you pronounce this? And even the Japanese will say, oh, you can pronounce it like this or like that. It's fluid. And then there are different styles. So you Chinese kanbun, well, I don't want to go into the details here, but you can write Japanese in a way that is grammatically like Chinese. Now, Chinese grammar is entirely different to Japanese grammar. So the way that you have to fit one set of grammars into another set of characters is mind-boggling complex sometimes. And then fluid meaning and pronunciation. As I said, each of the characters that we have in Japanese have at least 2 pronunciations, entirely different pronunciations, often 3 or 4, 5 or 6 pronunciations, and they are pronounced differently depending on the context. You just have to learn it or keep relearning it, because we keep forgetting, well, I keep forgetting. And then simply in terms of script, there's I won't go into details, but there's a hiragana script, a katakana script, a kanji script. And sometimes you can choose to write a word in either kanji or hiragana or katakana, and they all kind of mean the same thing. But when they're written in a particular style, one of these, when either hiragana or katakana or kanji, it has a certain feel about it, which you have to try and work out as a translator. These are practical problems for a translator of Japanese. And then a third way of looking at translation is the business of translation. That is the whole industry of translation. There's in other words, there's the politics of literary translation. Edward Fowler, an American scholar, wrote a really, really interesting article quite a few years ago about the politics of Japanese literary translation in the post-war period. He pointed out that most of or really all the texts that were translated tended to downplay anything nationalistic or indeed left-wing about Japanese society in the post-war period, because it was really for an American, mostly English-speaking American market, and they were looking for, they wanted to see a Japan that was nice, that was cultured, that was zen, that was poetry, that was beauty, that was gentle. They didn't want to see warriors. They didn't want to see the rise of the Japanese Communist Party and so on. Whereas, in fact, the left was very powerful, and there were a lot of quite Marxist writers who were active at that time. So there's a politics of what is chosen to be translated. So that is part of translation studies, if you like. Also, I mentioned male-female writers. Most or many of the writers were male who were being translated in the immediate post-World War II period, and whereas you may know a lot of, one thing about Japanese literature is there are lots and lots of really, really fascinating female writers, going all the way back to the Tale of Genji and so on. So, and it's only in the last, shall we say, 2 decades or so that we see a lot more Japanese women writers being translated. And that relates to translators themselves. A lot of female translators of Japanese literature have, I think, seen it their role to draw our attention as, mostly for non-Japanese readers, to be able to enjoy Japanese literature and enjoy the richness of the female viewpoint in writing. And then there is the whole publishing, the commercial interest. Murakami Haruki, who I must admit is not one of my favorite writers, but an extremely popular writer, an extremely influential writer, and I thank him very much because he's brought so many people into Japanese literature. And so many of my students in the past have written fascinating articles and papers on Murakami. But there is a whole commercial side to this. I mean, the industry of Murakami Haruki is mind-boggling, and the amount of money and planning that goes into the next wave, or the next Murakami publishing venture is huge. And finally, related to business, the financial barriers against literary translation, by which I mean there are many people who would love to sit down and translate a long Japanese novel. But my experience is to translate, say, a 350-page novel takes 2 years. For me, it takes 2 years. And that's almost full time. And even if you are a professional translator, you haven't got time to sit down and do that, because, not to give anything away, you're lucky if you get £6,000 for translating a novel. Now, you can't live on £3,000 a year. And then translation can mean something related to the historical context of translation. Where is it coming from? Because that affects the style we use when we try and translate something. We're aware of what's happening and what the little echoes of history and culture that are going on in the background that inform the original author's words. And then more practical problems of translation. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to leave this because I think this is about the whole relationship between pure sort of highbrow, pure literature and popular literature. But I can do that another time. It's another big subject. I haven't got time to do that. But I'm going to go to some practical problems. And so I've given some context, hopefully, but I want to now just tell you about some of the difficulties that in my case that I've experienced, and that other people might experience. And it'd be great if you could see what you think about these, and if you've got any questions about these. First of all, is literary genre. That is, how do you translate Japanese poetry? I mean, Japanese prose to a certain extent, you're kind of, you can see what's being said and you translate it. I mean, that sounds pretty banal sort of thing to say, but you can kind of see the progress and you have a certain leeway in how you translate it. But poetry, I mean, of all genre, poetry, every word counts. The location of the word counts. If it's a Romanized script, if it's capitalized, if there's pronunciation, you know, a comma or a colon or something like that. I mean, it all counts. How do you do that in Japanese? Or rather, if you've got a Japanese poem, how do you do that? How do you convey the meaning? Now that sounds obvious, but that's a loaded term. What does it mean? I'm not going to give any solutions here. I'm just pointing out what the problems are. And also disjointed grammar. That is, when you have a Japanese text that is clearly ungrammatical. It could be describing a kind of an emotional breakdown, and someone's language becomes broken up. Think of it another way around. Imagine, I find it hard to imagine, but imagine you are a Japanese translator translating Faulkner or very famous person, but I can't remember his name at the moment. James Joyce, that's right. Someone like James Joyce. I mean, how on earth do you translate that? And I've heard some people on the English literature side or will say, be a bit snooty about it. Or how do the Japanese translate Shakespeare? And people will say, of course you can't, because Shakespeare is entirely his own genre. And that's true, but a translator doesn't give up, the translator has a bone and bites on it and chews on it and has to do something. And if we didn't have translators, well, we would never be able to at least try and form linkages amongst cultures. Culturally specific expressions. To give you a few examples, in Life for Sale, there's a description of a Westerner who's he's tall and skinny. And he's described as skinny as a kamakiri. And kamakiri is a praying mantis. Now, I think that's a fantastic description. You can imagine the big bulbous eyes, the long skinny body. Do you leave it like that? If I said, oh yeah, if I said to you, you know, if we were in a pub together and we saw someone there and I said, oh, look at him, he's as skinny as a praying mantis. Either people would think, what on earth is he talking about? Or they think, why use that term? So if you translate it literally, it means something. It has a certain feeling about it. And it really, you know, it means you're really playing for effect. Now, in the end, I probably translated it, he was as skinny as a rake or something like that. But those sort of things, you know, you could say the translator's not being honest, because why don't you just translate as it really is? I think probably someone like Lawrence Venuti would say, yeah, you should translate things and leave the foreignness of it in there. But that means something, because well, that adds something extra, because that sense of foreignness is not in the original, because obviously it's the original cultural context. So that's a kind of problem you have to deal with. Another one to bear in mind is with beautiful star. The Japanese is Utsukushii, beautiful, hoshi, star. So hoshi, the character, star. Now, within the story, the world, the earth, is often described as a beautiful star. Now, for those of us who know anything about astronomy, know that the earth is not a star. We have the sun, that is our star. So we're a planet, but the Japanese for planet is wakusei, and sei is the same as hoshi, it's the same character. So there's an ease for the Japanese to use that word star, which we don't have in English. Now, my conclusion was to leave it, because you can't change the title. I couldn't change the title. And then for people to suddenly, for people in the story to start saying, oh yes, it's a beautiful planet. Well, it jars. And so there was a lack of rationality there, but I just decided that you had to leave it. Another thing, revealing character through language. That is really revealing the character of the characters in the story. So I mentioned in Beautiful Star, Professor Haguro. He's a very pompous person, clearly irked by the fact that he's still an assistant professor. And he's full of bitterness, and his language is overblown and self-regarding. So the only way I could think of doing that was, unlike all the other characters, when I quoted him, well, you know, there's a lot of direct language between the characters. In his case, I never abbreviated. I never said, "Isn't it hot?" I'd say, "Is it not hot?" or something like that. And it sounds a little forced, but that was the way I dealt with it. I'm not saying it's the best way to do it, but that's what you have to deal with. Another one to mention is forgive me for the language, but in Life for Sale, there's a point at near the end where Hanyo, the main character, is being threatened with torture, and the gangsters, and the gangsters are threatening him and saying, "Why don't you come over to our side?" And it's kind of the culmination of Hanyo's frustration. Hanyo seemed like a very easygoing character. It doesn't really matter. He wants to kill himself. And, you wonder, what's going on inside the head of this person? And there is a moment in that story where I think it bubbles over. And, I cannot actually remember the Japanese at the moment, but he probably says to them something like, "Bakayaro, you idiots, you idiots." But I thought, no, this has got to be a big moment. So I said, "Fuck you." And now you could say, "Oh, well, that's really going beyond what it really was." But actually, Lucy North, who was a really good translator, she read through my first version, and she taught me. She said, "What you've got to do, Steve, when you read this stuff, you've got to think to yourself as a translator, not what is the exact meaning. You may start that way, but ultimately you have to say to yourself, what are they saying?" And so I use my intuition. So I kind of jumped that chasm and went and plumped for that word. Whether it's right or not, or I'm not sure. Next one, the unspoken atmosphere of the novel. This relates to the tone or the grammar or the actual word choice of the original, and how do you convey that? In Beautiful Star, it's a mix. There's this irony in the sense that in Beautiful Star, the question is this real? Are they really aliens, or are they deluded human beings? So there's a certain ambiguity about that, and somehow you've got to try and convey that. Stages in the process of translation, just a sense of how it was for me as a translator. And for both of these books, it was the same. When you first start, you're full of excitement. You think, "I really want to do this." And then you get to about a third the way through and you begin to think, this is a long novel, and every sentence needs effort, and you have to work at it. And it's really tough. But somehow you get to the end of it. By the time you get to the end of it, you're exhausted and you think, "I should never have done this." The second time you go through it, it's still like, "Oh, what does it really mean?" You're trying to tidy up and so on. The third time you go through it, you begin to get little flickers of excitement and think, "Oh, it could be this." And then by about the fourth stage, you're beginning thinking, "Oh, this works." And then it's all done. You hand it in, and then you read it through again, and you think, "Damn, I could have rewrite it in a different way." So there's always a kind of dissatisfaction related to it. The relationship between author and translation. My advice is ideally deal with dead authors, because they can't answer back. I would really not like to have to deal with a living author, because they'll start saying, "Oh, I meant this, I meant that," and not meaning to be rude about authors. Authors write what they do. They put it out there, and then it's public property, and then it's for the translator to do their best to make sense of it. And I would hate to have an argument over it with an author if I think it means something else. I know that sounds arrogant, but, you know, we all have to make our choices. And then specifically with my relationship with Mishima, as I said at the beginning, I think, because I'm gay, when I was first in Japan and I read Mishima, I was blown away that we had someone writing in the 40s and 50s who was talking about homosexuality very openly. And so I have a kind of affinity towards Mishima. And yet there's a lot about Mishima that I find repulsive. I mean, he writes beautifully, but he's also, there's a narrowness of him, and there's a viciousness in there which I don't really like. And finally, the practical problem, editors. Well, I spoke about Lucy North. I mean, and also with both the Penguin books, editors are absolutely vital. You need someone you can trust, who will give you who will come back with page after page of suggestions. To revisit what you've written, and invariably those suggestions are positive. I did have one more page, but I think I will stop now, if that's okay, Hannah.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Steve. I'd love to hear you talk even more about this, but yeah, it's
Hannah, I think you're muted.
Hang on, I've unmuted myself.
Oh, sorry. My speaker went off. Sorry about that. I'm not a very technical person, right? Okay.
That's okay.
Okay, now right.
That's okay. I'm glad you can hear me.
Yeah,
no, I'd be happy to hear you talk on and on. Actually, so interesting. Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate that. And there's so many sort of things in there I'd like to sort of get you to expand on and say more about. I'm quite in danger of sort of rambling, really, but I want to give other people to ask a question, and just to say to our audience, if you want to ask Steve a question, now is the time to pop something into the Q&A box there, which is open for you, or you can put one directly into the chat, and we'll pick your questions up when you do. I'm sorry, I should have probably mentioned that before you started speaking, Steve. Yeah. But anyway, but just to give people time to formulate one, I've sort of formulated one as well that I really want to ask you about, and this is something that me and my students have also been thinking about. And then I want you just to tell us about your decision to revisit Mishima, and how that came about. I mean, obviously at the start, and you mentioned as well that you went to Columbia University, where you did your doctorate with Donald Keene. And I remember him visiting, I remember very much him visiting us at SOAS when I was your MA student, and we had a discussion. And at the time we were studying Mishima, and you made us all watch Yukoku.
The film.
We were reading several of his stories as well, and we were all intrigued by, and I think dazzled by, this kind of fact, as you kind of mentioned right at the beginning as well, of Mishima's suicide, but that not just that he's written these texts beforehand that are all sort of about that as well, or seem to be. And it's sort of almost like you get to the point where after he commits suicide, how do you go back and reread those stories? Because it's almost like in that act he's sort of controlled our reading of them. But I think one of the things that I really like about your actually I should mention here, you've also written a lovely article for Japan Forum, and you are sort of talking really about the afterlife of Mishima's writing, and your approach really is to look at it and look at these the sort of mosaic of characters in his not Utsukushii Hoshi, The Life for Sale. As sort of multiple fragments of Mishima's own personality, both, you know, his physical being and his and his literary body, and just as a way of refragmenting all these various things that Mishima were, and finding an avenue through which to sort of translate him and interpret him afresh. And so yeah, I'm sorry, I've really gone on there, but I just sort of thought that was so interesting and so nice about your approach to him, and I just sort of wanted to hear what you had to say about, you know, why Mishima and why now, and all of that.
Well, as I told you, there was a you know, after I'd finished the Kaji book, I wasn't lost. I mean, well, yeah, I was lost. I mean, I think being lost is a good thing. Out of, you know, it's like being babes in the wood. If you're not in the wood, you're not going to find, there's no way out, because there's no process of going out. So I was definitely rooting around for someone to translate, and I hadn't thought about Mishima. And then actually it came to me. I was approached by Penguin, because I think they'd asked Richard Bowring to do it at Cambridge, and Richard didn't want to do it, and he very kindly suggested me. And so, you know, I got this call or an email from, you know, Penguin saying, would you be prepared to translate a Mishima novel as a Penguin classic? I mean, what would you say? And so I said, yeah, of course. I said yes. I had never read it. I never read Life for Sale, but then I thought, oh, this makes sense because of the, you know, the sexuality side. And Mishima was, I felt, you know, there's this whole, particularly all these serious novels have been translated, but the more popular ones have not. And my argument about a work like Life for Sale is it's clearly this trashy, shallow thing, but it also tells important stories as well that, you know, that we can take seriously. So that's how I got into Mishima. And then having done that, then I found out about A Beautiful Star, and I like sci-fi, and I thought I must do Beautiful Star. And so that's how I do that. But I must say, I am also wary of this, because I know there's a kind of Mishima boom happening, and I'm not exactly sure why, but I am nervous about it in the sense, what's his name? John Treat came to give a talk at SOAS, and John Treat is a really amazing critic or writer. He was at Yale for many years, and he's retired now. I think he's writing novels now, actually. But somehow we had a kind of, I was interviewing him for a talk, and we had a question and answer, and this thing about me translating Mishima came up, and John Treat said to me, oh, so that means you are promoting the rise of the far right in Japan. I said, oh, I guess I am, yes. And it does, you know, I think part of this interest in Mishima is part of a zeitgeist, which is sort of taking seriously the attraction of a kind of new fascism that's arising, or, you know, there's a possibility of that. And you know, let me state, you know, I'm not for that. But I think so I'm aware of that, but I think there's a lot to be said about Mishima, which relates to, yes, his place in popular media, his role as a media product, and also in Beautiful Star. I intend to write a paper about this at some point, and I think a lot of it is to do about a profound emptiness and loneliness at the heart of Mishima, which is, I swear, so much of his angst and anger and violence comes out of. But finally, I know I'm going on now, but finally, I relate to this whole thing about him killing himself. This is one reason why I really cannot stand him, because he is such a control freak. This is someone who must have thought, when I cut my belly open, and, you know, he ends literally, if you can find these terrible images online if you care to look, you know, basically the final image is of him and the person, another one of his companions who committed harakiri, their severed heads on plates. I mean, sorry to leave you that image at lunchtime, but you know, really grisly. And inevitably the story is, how does this fit in with his life? Well, I'm trying to just not go there as much as I can, but I will have to deal with it at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I managed not to sort of complete what I was saying beforehand.
Right.
But just in terms of Donald Keene, I always remember him responding to our questions and about Mishima's suicide, because of
Yeah.
course he knew him,
Mm,
and just pointing out that he also had a family and loving,
mm,
wife
mm.
and children who were
Yes.
devastated. And
Yeah.
I always thought that other element of Mishima,
Yes.
or the multiplicity of Mishima, is something
Yes.
that, yeah, gets
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
obscured, and like you say, people focus on just the more sort of graphic, pornographic violence of his death.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for that. It's really fascinating. I've got some
Okay.
questions now, so we should go to them.
Yep.
There's one from Aidan Fraser, and she says, "Hi, Stephen. I've
Yeah.
more of a question about Mishima than translation theory.
Okay.
I'm currently reading Confessions of a Mask for my
Yeah.
dissertation piece and would like your insight on a particular topic. I want to ask if you have made any particular note, as both a translator and a gay man, of Mishima's fondness towards classical figures in
Yes.
the context of his queerness."
Um, I'm just trying to remember. Well, he certainly he draws on um, uh, I'm struggling to remember the exact details. He certainly goes into details about like sort of Greek uh, stories, I think. I'm not quite sure what he means actually. I mean, Mishima himself was very aware of that classical tradition, which he identified in Greece. In fact, he visited Greece at least once. He may have gone twice, but he was definitely drawn to the whole, the idea of male beauty and so on from Greece. But on the other side, there is another side, which is the samurai tradition, which is it's two-sided. It's very homoeroticized, and there was a tradition of taking male lovers amongst samurai warriors, which Mishima was able to draw on. At the same time, and this actually reveals itself in a lot of Mishima's writing himself, there's a strong aspect of misogyny. That is in the samurai tradition. I mean, to put it crudely, sex is bad, but if you're going to do it, at least do it with another guy. and if you have to produce children, but there's a certain, it's in that sense, women are dismissed as in terms of the possibility of equality. So this is the yes. I cannot remember all the classical. When you say, I think Western classical aspects. Did you mean?
Yes, she mentions
Yeah.
a Greco-Roman.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have reread it quite recently, but I'm getting too old. I can't remember all the details. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's really interesting. Okay, so just I'm going to go on to another question. Miwako Hayashi Bitmeat says, "Thank you for your interesting lecture. In Japan, there are a lot of dialects spoken. Have you ever come across them while translating?
Oh yeah.
How did you deal with them?"
So that's so interesting. I mean, there are sort of not notorious, but notoriously difficult ones to translate. So, for instance, Tanizaki Junichiro wrote a really, really interesting novel called Manji, which is actually about a lesbian relationship in the 30s. And it's based in Osaka, and it's all conversation. It's all Osaka dialect. I cannot remember how that's translated or how that's touched on. But what I'm saying is, you're right. There are so many, almost different languages within Japan, and somehow you have to, try and deal with it. One way that you can't do it, I think, and I've seen this, some people have tried, I don't know, to, if someone is coming from the Tohoku region, the northeast of Japan, you might be tempted to say, oh, I'll turn them into Geordies, sort of like a Geordie accent. Like my dad is a Geordie, so, they'd be saying things like, Hawaii, things like that. But obviously that just is ridiculous. You laugh. And it's also incredibly specific to, it's specific to our culture. If you're an American, you might use, I don't know, an Appalachian dialect, which wouldn't mean anything to anyone outside of America. The way, there was one particular point in a Kaji story where the main character goes to a brothel and he meets a young girl who's come from the countryside, and she speaks, it's only a few sentences. She speaks in a particularly rather lovely mellifluous dialect, and I just wrote it out in standard English, and I said she was speaking in her local dialect, something like that. That's how I did it. So there's no real answer. You have to, if the whole thing was in dialect, I don't know how you'd have to find a better translator than me. I don't know. I'm not sure how I would do it, but it's an excellent point. Yeah.
I think the breasts and eggs is all in sort of Osagaben, isn't it?
Yes,
and I
yes.
think the translators there chose an American dialect or something like that. But I think you're always going to alienate someone when you do that, because you know, could think, no, when I read this, I thought it should be, in Manchester.
Yes, but actually that sort of touches on one of the concluding points that I didn't get time to say, which is that every translator it's a matter of making choices, and we know this from our sort of theory, with Saussure and a language theory, that every time you choose something, you dismiss all those infinite possibilities that are there, and you have to live with it. It's fluid, and so no translation is perfect, and you just have to. The only fear that I have as a translator is when once the stage of translation I didn't mention is the reviews, when and something like Mishima, there were a lot of reviews of Life for Sale came out, so I was thrilled about that, but my greatest fear was like reading it through. I was waiting for that sentence that said, "What a shame the translation is so wooden," or something like that. I mean, fortunately it wasn't. It didn't, but that is that would be devastating.
Yeah, it would, but of course not.
Yeah.
Anyway, right. So let's we've got loads of questions that are coming out. So one more. Are you okay for a?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Yes.
One or just going to choose one
fine.
or two more questions.
As long as you want. Yeah.
Okay. There's Max Warwick, who said, very interesting talk. Thank you so much. My question is also more about Yukio Mishima than translation. Yoshikuni Igarashi writes about Yukio Mishima as a writer that tried to force Japan's national humiliation back into the national discourse to encourage a stronger Japan. Oh, is this something you agree with? If so, does it come through in his writings broadly? And if not, do his notorious right-wing inclinations? I mean, this is something we sort of talked about a little bit.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Well, I mean, definitely, yeah. I mean, Mishima is interesting because he is talking about the sense of national loss. He is a product of that. He is although we think he was a post-World War II writer, he made his debut as like 15 or 16, as still a high school student during the war. And if you read Confessions of a Mask, you'll see that how deeply affected he was by the idea, or by the war loss. And in fact, there's a bit in Life for Sale which I think really touches on the war. It's almost like a surrealistic moment where he's talking about a cat, and he says it's like looking into the maw of a cat, the mouth of a cat, and you look right deep into that sort of smelly, fishy mouth of the cat, and you can see the ruins of a city. Now, I think he's talking about the ruins of Tokyo or so on. So he's scarred, deeply scarred by that, and he's trying to make sense of it. Do I agree with that? Well, I think he's very interesting because he is responding to it, and a lot of writers are not responding to it, or they're slipping into a kind of more idealistic, nostalgic kind of Japan that has nothing, that skips an engagement with the war. Although you could equally say that even that nostalgia itself is a response to the war. So Mishima is doing his own thing, but I always feel that Mishima is I've always tried to say to students who are impressed by Mishima, love Mishima, love the way he writes, and he writes he writes beautifully sometimes, extraordinary, and he's so insightful and so sharp. But don't be taken in. This is, you know, sort of my prejudice coming up. Don't be taken in by his, you know, banging the military drum and so on. It's, no, that itself is a fantasy. You know, there's a particular picture that was really stuck with me, where I told you he developed this little group, the Tatenokai, the Shield Society, this group of young men that he would go up and down Mount Fuji. And there's a picture of him sat in Japan, you have these huge bathtubs. He sat in the tub, about 6 of these cute young men. I've never seen Mishima with a broader grin on his face. You know, he's obviously in 7th heaven. So to what extent he's really into militarism, I don't know. But on the other hand, he did something real, which had devastating effects on people's lives, not least of all, many of those, you know, one of those young men who died with him. So it's serious, but don't take him too seriously. That's what I would say. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting point of view there, and insight into that. Yes, how do you deal with all of that, right? Just, I'll see if I can pick out one more. We've got so many excellent questions.
Yeah.
There's one from Joy Hendry, who says, thanks for a great talk, Stephen. Really interesting. I've always found novels a good way to understand other cultures, second only to anthropology, of course. What do you think? Are you more concerned to get across the thoughts of the individuals in the novel in the language of the translation?
Ah, boy, yes. Well, I certainly agree. Anthropology is a very important subject. In a sense, yeah, literature and anthropology, they overlap so well, I think, in so many ways. Yes, the thoughts of the individuals. I mean, this comes back to that question that Lucy North said to me, you know, what do people really, you know, when they say something, what do they mean? And ultimately, literature, it's obvious, it's language. And the only way you can try and express the reality that as a translator, well, first as a reader, that you pick up, that is the kind of atmosphere that you sniff and try and make sense of, is through language. I'm just somehow, one little bit from Life as I was coming back to me, where Hanyo is involved in a kind of a detective-y. There's a bit of the story, there's almost like a detective story, and he's preparing himself for the morning. He's going to go out and do something very impressive in the novel, and there is he's got someone in the same room with him, and this other person is rather a bit dim, but he's obviously a kind of right-wing nationalist, and he says to Hanyo, "Oh, Hanyo, you truly are a great person," or something like that. And now, to give Mishima credit, through Hanyo, he reveals a kind of cynical side, an awareness of the ridiculousness of that narrow-minded right-wing view. And he does it actually not specifically through what Hanyo says, but what he does. He has in his hand, he has a bun, and it's a kind of it's a shoe cream. You know, that is you know, like it's got custody. They're delicious. There's one of my favorite bits of Japan, shoe cream. So you bite into it, and he bites into it, and as he bites, a piece, sort of like a squiggle of yellow cream comes out and curls around. And to me, it's like the rising sun. And I think, you know, Mishima may have done something, you know, in terms of killing himself. You know, that's very serious. But at least 2 years earlier, when he's talking about suicide and the militarism and the emperor and the rising sun and all that stuff, he's perfectly aware of the utter ridiculousness of it at the same time. So I think, to that extent, that's his character. I'm not sure that really answered Joy's question.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And we're really over time, but should we just one last question?
One
okay. So this is from Toshio Watanabe. He says, "Hi, Stephen. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. I agree with his loneliness. I actually met Mishima and our brother Hiroyuki together
Yes.
and felt that Mishima wasn't a type of bullish and coarse right-wing person.
No.
His colloquial language in private was very polite,
Yes.
almost feminine. I
Yes.
feel his Hagakure
Yeah.
piece shows the difference
Yeah.
from a standard militarism in Japan. I mean,
Yeah.
that really accords with what Donald Keene was saying about him,
Yes.
and
Yes.
how much,
Yeah. Yeah.
he was such a charming man. And
Yes, I know. I know another really important translator, Paul McCarthy. That's not Paul McCartney. Paul McCarthy, who's translated a lot of Tanizaki. He lives in Tokyo, and we met up at one point, and we were talking about Mishima, and I said to Paul, "Oh, I'm not sure I really like. I'm not sure I'd like to have met him. There's something about I don't like." And he said, "Oh, he was such a charming man, such a lovely man." And yet, one thing I've noticed in Mishima is occasionally there are depictions of white people which are quite derogatory. And I think partly that I respond to it partly because we white people, or white people like me, are not used to having those kind of depictions. So it's actually a salutary lesson, the way people describe other races or other groups of people in a kind of stereotypical derogatory way. It's quite interesting, and I take that as a good lesson. On the other hand, his language is it can be quite unpleasant, but at the same time, I think in reality he was very much enamored by the West. He absolutely was keen to have relationships with Western academics. I mean, he and Donald King were very close, great friends, so he's a contradiction. I mean, I love him, I hate him, but that's precisely why I want to study him, because I think, especially as you get older, it's the ones that you can't work out that, as I say, it's like, unfortunately, one of my teeth has dropped out, so I haven't got many teeth left. But as an academic, I've been biting onto, you want to bite onto things that are problems. I mean, who cares about the things you can work out? They're not important.
I think that is exactly that sort of like polarized aspect of him that is so endlessly fascinating. It sort of creates a paradox within that sort of one body of work, and within the physical body that was Mishima. So yes, it's definitely it makes it a rich person and set of texts to return to.
Can I just add one thing related to loneliness? In several of his novels, well, in both of these novels in different places, I can't remember exactly where, he has descriptions of the city at nighttime. So there'll be a character stuck in a little room, and outside he can hear the sound of the city and the neon lights of Tokyo. And there's one beautiful bit where it's the deep, rich ocean of the city, waves of sound, like little flickering flying fish going through the waves. And you get this sense of utter loneliness. He describes this Tokyo is teeming with young men and young women who are filled with sexual desire, and they're like amoeba. They're just like milling around, coming together, going up in different places. It feels like it's this contradiction of endless possibilities of coming together, and yet never really making those links. And that, I think, in a sense, that's at the heart of the real source of the strength of his literature. It is like, this is my final comment, it is like that Michelangelo picture where you've got the hand of God and man, or mankind, and they're like that, but they don't touch. And Mishima is so aware of the power of language, but ultimately he can only talk about how you cannot quite get there. And
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you again for coming today. I've really enjoyed the session. I'm sure all our listeners have too. But yeah, hope to see you soon, and take care.
All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.